Oh, I don't, did the recording start with someone else?
I think Devin just started the button.
Oh, okay, great.
Not
right? Yeah.
intentionally.
Oh, that is
Okay, we are beginning. So it's because our start time is 12. So it is recording and we are live right now.
Oh, great. All right. Perfect. Welcome, everybody. We'll give folks a minute or two to log on here, and then I'll introduce our speaker.
Awesome, because I need a minute or two to get.
Okay, great.
Sorry about my delay in joining.
That's okay.
And I think that, well, maybe it's on my end, I need to update the display name.
Okay.
So I'll get my slides shared
Sure.
first, and we'll update that.
Okay, yeah, do you want to make sure, why don't you share your slides, Christine, and make sure that's working, and then once those are up, I can introduce you.
Great. So I am getting a advanced sharing options notification, as opposed to allowing me to share my screen. Let me see if there's, okay, here we go.
Okay. Great. Yep, it's starting to see it come through.
Great. So are you seeing the full screen or the note screen?
I can see the full screen.
Okay, awesome.
So yeah, I think it's working. Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Keith Baumann-Gregson, and I'm an environmental scientist at the State Water Board's Office of Information Management and Analysis. And I want to welcome you all to our monthly Water Board's Water Data Seminar Series. So thank you for attending. All these seminars are open to the public and are recorded, and we'll be then posting them on the College of Water and Informatics webpage. And for more information or to sign up for the email list, you can visit the College of Water Informatics webpage, and I'll pop that in the chat here in a moment. And after the talk, there'll be a question and answer period. So during the talk, you can type in any questions that you have into the Q&A box, and we will then address them at the conclusion of the presentation. And everyone except the speaker will be muted today. Also additionally, during the Q&A session, we'll be posting a brief survey. So we ask that you all fill that out so we can continue to improve our seminar experience. And so with those little background information out of the way, I am pleased to introduce today's speaker. So today we have Dr. Christine Lee, who is a scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And Dr. Lee completed all her undergraduate and graduate education at UCLA, obtaining degrees in chemical and environmental engineering. And then after completing her PhD, she held a postdoctoral position at JPL, and then also received a Science and Technology Fellowship at NASA headquarters. She then joined JPL permanently in 2014, where she has worked on numerous projects related to using satellite remote sensing to provide information for water resource assessment and management. And her work and contributions to NASA missions have been highly regarded and earned her a NASA Early Career Public Achievement Medal in 2019. And so we're very privileged to have her here joining us to speak about monitoring water quality with satellite remote sensing. And so with that, thank you, Dr. Lee, for speaking to us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you, Keith. I'm really happy to be here. I am looking forward to sharing ways in which satellite remote sensing can change and enhance the way that we're monitoring water quality and understanding environmental systems. I really do feel that it provides an added perspective to point data and models that many of our colleagues in management are relying upon. So one of the main goals of the presentation that I have today is to show how in situ data monitoring and remote sensing are complementary to each other, and how they can be used together to support improved monitoring efforts, as well as how we might look forward to looking at coastal and inland aquatic ecosystems. So many people think of NASA as an agency that puts rovers on Mars and studies far off galaxies, and we definitely do that. And even as someone who has worked as a postdoc at JPL, that was a period where I was focused primarily on applying microbial and molecular detection methods to understanding life in extreme environments. And I was fairly siloed from a lot of the earth scientists that were working at JPL, just due to focusing on my own research. And I think that's probably something that others who are working in government entities can relate to. So it really wasn't until I went to NASA headquarters on the AAAS Policy Fellowship that I came to fully appreciate what NASA Earth Sciences is doing, what they're all about. And this mission really resonated with me as someone who was trained up in environmental sciences and engineering. And so as you can see here, NASA and our other space agency partners in other countries around the world, we work together to launch these different Earth observing satellites, each of which are designed to help us unlock understanding of how water, carbon, and energy are being cycled on an Earth system scale. And we are fully committed to understanding Earth as a system across land, air, and sea, how it's changing, and how we can use this information for direct societal benefit. And so my role with the NASA Water Resources Program is to help translate the work that we're doing that's advanced through these Earth observing satellites to a more practical context, to a management level, to a resources management level, so that we can help NASA further optimize our investments in addressing growing challenges around water availability, water quality, ecosystems, and of course, climate change. And so what kind of information can we retrieve from satellites that are most relevant to sort of the water resources, water quality arena? And so the previous slide that I showed gave you a sense of the density of Earth observing satellites orbiting the Earth, but we can derive really critical information about the water cycle using those satellites. And so we can understand advanced understanding around precipitation and runoff through improved weather forecasting models. We can also better predict stream flow measurements to support reservoir management. Of course, water quality is what I'll be focusing on in the talk today. But in addition to those parameters, we also can inform water information around agriculture water use and evapotranspiration, soil moisture and drought, snow properties, and groundwater as well. And so as I'm going to be focusing on water quality today, I would be happy at some point to share information about some of these other areas as well. So how do we currently study water quality from space? Well, we largely rely on two different classes of satellites. The first class is our satellites that are designed to study the ocean. So they're optimized for studying ocean properties. So when you compare water and land surfaces, you can actually visually see that water is a dark target. It absorbs a lot more energy than land does and thus reflects back less. And so ocean imagers are designed to have a high signal to noise, have many more spectral bands, and have high fidelity. But the main trade-off that we have with ocean imagers is that they tend to have a coarser spatial footprint. So that makes it more difficult to utilize them fully in coastal and inland aquatic systems. On the other hand, we also have another class that is considered land imagers. And because land is a bright target, they don't necessarily implement as many spectral bands. They have lower SNR, and they also are focused on land processes, which change at a lower frequency. So the revisit time is around 10 to 16 days. But on the plus side, we have much better spatial resolution, which is what we need to resolve some of these more complex inland water systems. And so how can we combine the two of these to help advance understanding of water quality in coastal and inland systems? So fundamentally, these imagers operate on very similar principles that are optimized based on the targets, as I was mentioning, whether it's water or land. Here's a quick illustration of some of these principles. We have our sun that is the primary source of energy, emitting energy to the Earth's surface. And as this energy is traveling to the Earth's surface, there are all of these physical processes that are affecting those energy particles, resulting in energy that is absorbed, some that is reflected, and some that is scattering. And what we see with our overpassing sensors, whether it's mounted on an aircraft or from a satellite platform, is whatever the resulting energy is that's reaching the sensor. And so scientists and engineers have to develop ways to kind of partition what's happening at each of these physical processes so that we can then understand, okay, well, what is the contribution of the energy that's being assessed that's due to land surface properties or aquatic properties. And definitely studying, I would say studying water bodies does add an additional layer of complexity here, because many of the processes that we're seeing going on in the atmosphere also occur in the water as well. We have these in-water constituents that can cause differences in reflected, absorbed, and scattered light that is detected ultimately at the sensor. And so here are some of those primary constituents that can affect those properties. And so to really fully utilize remote sensing in a way that's practical and useful, we rely on kind of these three different areas. Of course, the remote sensing measurements, which are an assessment of what we call apparent optical properties. And we essentially are deriving the ratio between the amount of energy that is being directed to the Earth's surface relative to the amount that is being measured at the sensor. And so we derive surface reflectance from these measurements made from space and air. And we also have to account for what's going on within the atmosphere. We also look at in situ optical data, which we refer to as inherent optical properties. So essentially characterizing at a physics level the absorption and backscattering properties going on within the water column. And we can use these measurements to essentially derive reflectance from the water surface. And that allows us to better understand whether we're appropriately accounting for the atmosphere. And then of course, there's the measurement of water quality parameters or biogeochemical parameters. And so we can relate the three of these and essentially then link the remote sensing measurements to water quality parameters such as turbidity or chlorophyll and so forth. So as I mentioned, there are a core set of constituents that we consider as the primary contributors to how light is being absorbed and scattered within the water column. And these include things like the amount of color dissolved organic matter, suspended sediment, chlorophyll. And we also have contributions due to the benthic floor. So this is especially an issue in areas where we have very shallow waters. And we do get a signal from sandy bottoms or from seagrasses that are from submerged aquatic vegetation as well. And so when we convert these parameters into kind of a spectral profile, you can see that each of them has kind of a unique signature across the visible to near infrared portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can use information such as these spectral profiles to estimate the amount of contributions or the concentrations of these components within the water column or at the surface of the water. But one thing to keep in mind is that currently our remote sensing assets, while we would love to be able to pull out this complete profile, that's not currently possible, although we did just get approval that NASA is going to be advancing towards building a satellite platform that can assess the full profile in this way, in addition to thermal. But our current satellite platforms are what we consider multispectral, which means that we are measuring across certain chunks of wavelengths on the order of 7 to 20 bands. And so we have to use kind of these snippets of information across these bands to assess what the water quality properties are within that aquatic ecosystem. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of examples that our team has been working towards. The first is looking at turbidity in the San Francisco Estuary, and we actually have two different application use cases for how we are applying satellite-based estimates of turbidity for understanding these conditions in the San Francisco Estuary. We're relying primarily on a semi-empirical method that accounts for both AOPs, the apparent optical properties, which we get from our remote sensing satellite measurements, as well as IOPs, the inherent optical properties, which are these A and C components within this equation, which would allow us to better tune this algorithm for local conditions. And if you're not familiar, just briefly, turbidity is a bulk temperature measurement that is an assessment of how light is scattered within the water column. And it is a fairly easy water quality parameter to measure. Often is used by citizen scientists and is linked to measurements such as the Secchi disk depth. And of course, we can also measure it using a spectrophotometric approach, which is why it is especially amenable to some of these remote sensing techniques, which are also optically based. And so there's a number of satellites that we can utilize for this turbidity modeling. I highlight one here, which is Sentinel-2A and 2B. This is actually an asset that is managed by the European Space Agency. And so I just wanted to briefly summarize and do this comparison between the water quality stations that have been instrumented throughout the San Francisco Estuary, of which there are 63 for turbidity that we had initially considered. And the main kind of benefit there is that they're acquiring every 15 minutes, whereas the satellites that we've been utilizing, their main benefit is this kind of spatial coverage and continuity. For Sentinel-2A and 2B, we have a temporal revisit of every 4 to 5 days. And our pixel size is actually 20 by 20 meters, but we do have over 36 million points over this region that we can consider for this study. The other asset that I didn't include in this table is called Spot 5, which actually has a spatial resolution in our study of about 2.5 to 5 meters. Interestingly, that one is also managed by the European Space Agency, but I'll also speak later to the Landsat series, which has been extremely beneficial in our studies as well. And so, of course, the San Francisco Estuary, many of us know, is a critical hub of California's water supply, a biodiversity hotspot, and underpins our agricultural economy in the Central Valley. It is also one of the most altered ecosystems in the world and is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which we've actually seen, and I'll speak to that further as well. The core of our studies tend to center around the Delta Smelt. And as the Delta Smelt has been in decline due to anthropogenic activity, as well as impacts from climate change, invasive species, and so forth. But our footprint in the Delta has resulted in these severe declines. And we saw in 2018, for the first time ever, the Delta Smelt Abundance Index hit 0 for the first time. I believe this was also the case in 2019. I haven't yet seen the 2020 values, but the overall trends that we've been seeing is this, what appears to be an almost irreversible decline in the Delta Smelt population in terms of the abundance index. And so for that reason, there are a lot of efforts by agencies operating within this region to try and mitigate these effects through better understanding environmental conditions and trying to improve habitat conditions so that we might be able to help them recover in some areas. And so one of the key goals of our work is to see where we can leverage satellite assets to increase understanding of spatial conditions of turbidity. And so here is a time series from the Spot 5 satellite showing the changes in turbidity conditions across the San Francisco estuary over time. And you can sort of see on some of the images conditions where we're exceeding the 12 NTU threshold for favorable conditions for the Delta smelt. And we can begin doing spatial analysis to see if there are hotspots of areas that are more favorable or less favorable for the Delta smelt. And so one of the key first steps in doing any kind of analysis with remote sensing data is that we have to evaluate these products relative to what is being observed on the ground. So you might recall that earlier slide where I showed kind of the three different types of data sets that are optimally combined to support these kind of studies and to support understanding of these systems. And so here's two examples. The first, of course, I mentioned was with Sentinel-2, where we derived turbidity across the San Francisco estuary and matched this up in space and time with station-based estimates acquired through or accessed through CDEC. We separated them out based on whether the surface-based stations were measuring in FNU or NTU. And we actually had a pretty good agreement between the satellite-based estimates and the ground-based estimates across this area, which gave us confidence to then apply the satellite-based algorithm to understand differences in spatial conditions across the estuary, which I'll go into that in the next slide. The second example that I'll talk about leveraged the Spot 5 satellite, in which our colleagues, Dr. Aaron Hester and Christiana Ade from the University of California, Merced, they were able to leverage this really nice high spatial and temporal data set to investigate the drought salinity barrier that was implemented in Frank's Tract a few years ago, as well as look for turbidity hotspots that showed conditions were suitable for the Delta smelt. And so the applications use case that we applied for the Sentinel-2 work focused on the Sassoon Marsh Salinity Control Gates action. This action was instituted to try and increase freshwater flows into the Sassoon Marsh and improve access to food-rich waters for the Delta smelt. And so we took a look at the satellite data during this period, and we were able to capture, there were numerous acquisitions leading up to, during, and following the Control Gates action. And we examined turbidity conditions during this period. But interestingly, you'll see that there were actually quite a few acquisitions leading up to, but we actually encountered a huge artifact in the imagery during the August to September timeframe during which this action was instituted. We got a ton of interference from the wildfires that were going on during that period of time. So we had to discard, I think, 4 or 5 images during that period of time. But luckily we had 2 clear day images that we could still use during the Control Gates action that allowed us to compare the turbidity conditions leading up to and during, and also one point following. And after controlling for tidal stages, we were able to confirm that the turbidity conditions within the Sassoon Marsh were definitely more favorable than they were upstream in the Sacramento River. This was consistent with what was seen with ground-based estimates of turbidity conditions as well. So I'm interested in also applying a temperature element to this as we can use temperature to also further examine how flow patterns may have changed. The second use case that I wanted to discuss was the Salinity Barrier that was instituted in spring of 2015 by California Department of Water Resources when they dropped 150,000 tons of rock into False River in the Central Delta to try and halt the encroachment of salinity into this region. A few months later, it was clear that the barrier worked as partners were able to detect that salinity would rise on one side, but did not rise on the other. But what we were interested in investigating with the Spot 5 data was what the impacts were on turbidity conditions. And so similarly, after controlling for tidal stages, we saw that during the flood stage, pre and post barrier, there was very minimal differences in these different portions of this region in terms of turbidity. But during the ebb stages, we saw that there was an increase of FNU. And I'll draw our attention to the fact that, especially in this reach, we saw an increase of 6.6 NTU overall, as well as just an overall shift towards higher turbidity levels that would be more indicative of favorable delta smelt conditions. In addition to investigating the impacts of the barrier, Christiana also investigated whether we could find or locate turbidity refugia. And she found that there were certain areas in which these refugia were persistent, but that they were very infrequently connected to each other. So even though they were distributed throughout the Delta, there was not a clear connectivity between these regions that would suggest that the Delta smelt could move between them as easily. But we were also able to look over this period of time to see how frequently waterways were considered suitable relative to turbidity conditions. And it was found with this data set that only 5% of waterways were considered suitable for 60% of the summer. So now I'd like to turn to water temperature. And we rely on a couple of different assets here as well. I'll speak to both work that we've been doing with the Landsat series as well as EcoStress. And so the Landsat series, we're primarily relying on 3 different Landsat satellites, Landsat 5, 7, and 8. And by piecing the temperature record from these satellites together, we can actually reconstructed a 35-year record of water surface temperature conditions in the Delta. And for the Landsat series, the overpass time is about the same, with each acquisition between 10 and 11 a.m. And the native spatial resolution is between 60 and 100 meters, but USGS does provide a resampled product of 30 meters. The other spaceborne asset that we're using is EcoStress, which is a thermal instrument on the International Space Station. It was launched in 2018. We have a temporal revisit of 1 to 5 days. The other really cool aspect of EcoStress and why I love it so much is that we sample at different times of day. And so in contrast to Landsat, some days we get measurements that are at 10 a.m. Some days we get measurements that are at 1 p.m., at 5 p.m., at 4 a.m., which has been really interesting in terms from an ecological perspective to look at that diurnal variability of water temperature conditions. These measurements have also been used for other applications, such as looking at urban heat island in Los Angeles and so forth. And so together we've been able to leverage these 2 spaceborne platforms to look at how the temperature conditions relative to the smelt in the San Francisco Estuary. And so as many of us know, water temperature is a critical factor governing habitat suitability in aquatic and estuarine systems. There are numerous studies that show that temperatures in the San Francisco Estuary habitat for the smelt are projected to increase, and that this is likely to translate to increases in conditions that are considered lethal to the endangered Delta smelt. And so how can we relate our remote sensing observations to these studies and help support actions on the ground? And so we just submitted a paper assessing changes in thermal habitat suitability for the Delta smelt using that 35-year record afforded to us by Landsat, and looked at this data record across SFE. We identified changes in annual maximums in water temperature, and we related this directly to the thermal tolerance thresholds of the Delta smelt and non-native fish. And we assessed trends over time relative to the Delta smelt abundance index. So I'll speak to that next. So the first thing we wanted to verify was whether water surface temperatures were indeed increasing in the San Francisco Estuary. And while this plot does not necessarily look like there's a direct increase, when we applied the Max Thielsen trend line to this, we did see an increase in median water surface temperatures going up over time, almost a 5-degree change. We then assessed thermal habitats by combining Landsat temperature pixels with thermal tolerance of the Delta smelt, Mississippi silverside, and the largemouth bass. These temperature thresholds were determined by, were taken from a paper published by Davis et al. In 2019, where they conducted laboratory studies investigating both the salinity and thermal tolerances of these 3 fish species. And so we translated these thermal tolerances to the pixel data that were derived using Landsat. And we saw that the unfavorable thermal habitat for the Delta smelt is expanding much faster, or is expanding more quickly for the endangered smelt versus the non-native fish. And this is due to the Delta smelt having a lower thermal tolerance than the Mississippi silverside and the largemouth bass. But at some point, these will likely increase at very similar rates once we're crossing over that critical temperature threshold for the non-native fish as well. But relative to wanting to support restoration efforts or impacts or the competitiveness of the Delta smelt to these non-native fish, these are the trends that we've been seeing over the last 35 years. And so when we took the difference between the changes in time over thermal habitat suitability for the Delta smelt versus the non-native fish, we can see that there's a much greater a kind of habitat compression occurring for the Delta smelt relative to the non-native fish. We also plotted the smelt abundance index from the midwater trawl data to the thermally unsuitable habitat area that we derived from Landsat. And so this plot might seem a bit scattered when you initially look at it, but what's important to consider here is that this is consistent with a limiting factors relationship, in which early on, when we have a mixture of thermally unsuitable surface area, that we see this variability in the Delta smelt abundance index. However, as we start to increase the amount of thermally unsuitable surface area, we start to see this relationship between the smelt abundance index and thermally unsuitable habitat surface area start to converge. And so right around the years where we start to see a approach towards 160 square kilometers, that's where we see a threshold in which statistically speaking, we wouldn't expect to see a recovery in the Delta smelt abundance index. And so here's just a quick snapshot of water surface temperature centered over Frank's tract. Over 2 years, just for comparison, so that we can take a look at regions that are, so 2005 is the year, sorry, I need to update this figure legend, obviously, but 2005 was one reference year that we took that showed less thermally unsuitable habitat, and we compared that to 2010, which had a greater distribution of thermally unsuitable habitat. Our next project takes a look at the diurnal variability of water surface temperature. So we've shown that with Landsat, as well as with EcoStress, that skin temperature may be useful for these long-term assessments of changing water temperature conditions and habitat suitability. But if we want to look at more localized conditions, we have to also take bulk temperature into account. And so here we begin to rely on CDEC water temperature values yet again. But the underlying thought around wanting to understand diurnal skin effect is the fact that at certain times of day, the temperature right at the top layer of a water body can at times be warmer than it is relative to the bulk. And at other times of day, particularly during midday, we see that relationship invert, where skin temperature is warmer at the top and cooler in the bulk conditions. And so how does this change over time? And how can we better use this to support local restoration efforts? And so working with a graduate student at Washington State University to further explore these questions and look at the kind of co-variability of surface and bulk temperature conditions, focused on open water stations in San Francisco Estuary. And we were able to see that there was up to a 2-degree difference between surface and bulk temperature conditions from those particular stations, both during midday periods as well as during evening periods. But the direction of the difference inverts between those 2 periods of time. And this diurnal skin effect is largely controlled by environmental conditions, and primarily solar radiation. But we also, in future work, will need to take into account things like water flows, water quality parameters, wind, and other factors as well. And so the spatial patterns that are revealed by using Landsat and EcoStress are also somewhat different. So you'll see in this upper left, because we can only acquire during one time of day with Landsat data, you could see that the conditions for throughout the day are quite different. So EcoStress reveals cooler conditions leading up to 11 a.m., warmer conditions between 12 and 7 p.m., and then cooling conditions for surface temperature at 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. And so we get a lot more understanding of what's going on within the system by being able to utilize EcoStress in combination with Landsat. And then when we zoom in further into this region, we can see that water temperatures can reach conditions that are known to cause thermal stress for the Delta Smelt, particularly in the afternoons. And that not all of the stations are able to capture these higher or these more thermally stressful periods for the Delta Smelt in terms of location. The last point that I wanted to make on, well, so for both the turbidity and the temperature work is that we're working with Bay Delta Live to make these data publicly accessible. So if you're interested in utilizing or viewing some of these data products, they have a map and web services element and have been building data dashboards to support those interested in looking and leveraging remote sensing data for turbidity and temperature through their portal. You can also download these data sets as GeoTIFFs. Ongoing work includes continuing to validate the chlorophyll products, which has been a challenge thus far. But the turbidity products are there now, and the temperature products are soon to be there. So the last project that I wanted to speak to was starting to look more closely at the relationship between terrestrial and coastal. And so I'm moving towards some of our Southern California work here now. And so the question that we've been asking is, given the expectation that California is going to continue experiencing these severe and extreme catastrophic wildfire seasons, how do we expect the changes in sediment, nutrient fluxes to change under these very drastic watershed disturbances? And so the first case study that we're looking into now is investigating conditions associated with the Woolsey Fire in 2018, which was a huge fire that burned across the Malibu Creek watershed in Southern California. And so we've begun to map the coastal turbidity plumes using both Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2. And these turbidity values, as you can see in this, this lower map here, gives you an indication of turbidity concentrations along the coast. This red outline here is the perimeter of the Woolsey Fire. And we then used a statistical approach to develop a plume threshold, which allowed us to convert the turbidity concentrations down here into a binary map that would then allow us to assess plume area extent. This work is being primarily conducted by two graduate students, one out of Jenny Jay's lab at UCLA, my former advisor with Marisol Sierra, as well as Anisha Bafna, who is a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania. And so together they've been writing the code to assess these turbidity plume area extents and how they've been changing throughout the Woolsey Fire period before and after as well. And so we've been combining both the satellite imagery with in situ measurements of fecal indicator bacteria. And so this is hot off the press. I just got these figures from Marisol and Anisha last night. Very excited to be able to share them with you. But essentially, so this leftmost panel represents the plume surface area assessments that are being done by this team. So we're leveraging data records from 2016 through 2020. And these are organized, as you can see, from July to June so that we can capture the wet season without having to truncate that within these plots. And so the dotted line shows 2016 to 2017. 2017 to 2018 is represented by this slightly longer dashed line. And then 2018 to 2019 represents the period during which they're characterizing plume area associated with the Woolsey Fire. And so we divided up our beaches and our regions into subregions so beaches that were draining, that were within the drainage area of the Woolsey Fire. Beaches that were within a drainage area where only a very small portion of the subwatershed was burned. And then beaches that were completely outside the burn area drainage. And we tried to select regions that were similar in terms of land cover composition so that the primary variable that was changing was the effect of the wildfire. And so what we see here is that the plume area surface extent appeared to change the greatest during the Woolsey Fire period for beaches inside the burn area. And then interestingly, for Enterococcus, we see these peaks very closely matching. And we see an increase in Enterococcus during the Woolsey Fire burn period and another peak that occurs later on in that wet season. And then when we look to 2018 to 2019 for Enterococcus, we see that the increases in Entero, although they did exceed the health threshold, were a lot more muted in the following year of 2019 to 2020. And then when we start to look at these other beach regions, we don't see quite as drastic of a change in both the plume area as well as Enterococcus concentrations, although you do see some increases that are associated with precipitation events. So precip has been a challenging parameter to control for, and we're still working on that as well. So in addition to that, our next steps in this research study is to apply a watershed model so that we can more quantitatively assess and characterize how changes in land cover, especially due to wildfires, result in changes in plume characterization, extent, concentration, and water quality. We also, there is a postdoc joining our group soon who's also going to be incorporating climate change projections into that watershed model, so we can also look into the future. And then we expect that remote sensing is going to be key in how we represent land cover, as well as how we constrain the model outputs for what's going on along the coast as well. And so that is, I think that was my final research slide. So I wanted to wrap up the talk with two closing thoughts. Again, to kind of make the case that for water quality information, particularly turbidity and temperature products, that we've made a fairly good case for being able to apply them for monitoring and ecosystem restoration applications, and that they've been a pretty good representation of conditions that are being measured by more conventional in situ approaches. And that they could also be useful for understanding impacts of climate change, because particularly with Landsat, we have such a extensive, multi-decadal record of spatial that has good spatial coverage of the conditions in these systems. And then secondly, I wanted to make the point that NASA and all the remote sensing data sets that I've shown here, they're all completely free and openly available. Obviously, it does take a bit of effort to sort of pre-process and prep the data, validate the data, so that then allows us to apply it to addressing questions about what's going on in the environment. And that I would strongly recommend establishing partnerships with those who are working with these large remote sensing data sets and raster data to help streamline and ramp up the use of these products, such as the ones that we have established by working with 34 North. And I think that's it. Thank you for listening. And please let me know what questions you have. I don't know, Keith, if I should take a look at the chat or okay, great. And then there's my email address.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Christine. That was amazing. You've been up to a lot of work. So thank you for both providing a bit of background information and then also sharing these great research output. So yeah, we have had a couple questions in the chat and the Q&A, and if anybody else has additional questions, please type them in and we'll be responding to that. And so one question that came up, this was from Beth Baldwin, was asking about using satellite-based monitoring for measuring trash levels in the San Francisco Bay, either in the water or on the land itself in the Bay Area. Can you respond to that one?
That is a wonderful question. And I wish I had some slides from one of my colleagues at JPL. So Michelle Girac, who is also in my group, has been investigating different ways in which we can detect particularly plastics over land sources as well as over the coastal ocean. So I will say that those algorithms are still in development, but she's had some really promising preliminary results in being able to identify plastics on land, as well as beginning to see potential plastics in the water too. Obviously, there's going to be a huge challenge with detection limits. So unless we have these huge aggregates, it may be pretty difficult to detect. But she's been, for example, she's been able to correctly identify the presence of, artificial turf and being able to distinguish that from I guess, real turf. She's been able to identify plastic mulch that's applied over agricultural regions. And there's just been a lot of good kind of laboratory scale proof of concept that there are different spectral signatures for plastics versus other in-water constituents. So it just is going to take some time to scale that up to some of our satellite assets, particularly in the shortwave infrared region.
Wow, that's great. Great to know that that work is already being done. Then in the question and answer, Sam Beshevkin had a couple questions. So the first one is about the long-term temperature trend you detected in the Delta. And you had commented that it was a 5-degree increase over 35 years. And he asked, was it so high because you were looking at those skin temperatures?
That could be a big part of it. And definitely the bulk temperatures will record a different, will likely be a different trend. And I do think that a lot of the climate change projections aren't necessarily looking at surface temperatures. They typically look at air temperatures. So between air temperature, water surface temperature, and bulk temperature, you'll likely see kind of varying degrees of what that trend will look like.
And I actually have a follow-up question to that, and I may have missed this in your talk, but could you explain a little bit on how you would separate out that skin versus that bulk temperature, like how you actually distinguish?
Yeah, so as of now, we're not separating them out. But the reason why we're investigating that is because we recognize that the skin temperature is going to be a lot more sensitive to these changes and have much more variability even on a diurnal cycle than bulk temperature conditions. But even so, we feel that there is a benefit to looking at surface temperature because we have such a long record of data for that product. But, again, trying to acknowledge that caveat that it doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one to bulk temperature. We definitely know this by looking at that diurnal cycle.
Okay, great.
But that project is very much interested in developing that parameterization between skin and bulk temperature with the vision towards being able to produce bulk temperature maps across SFE.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sorry for my confusion there, because I was like, wow, that sounds amazing if they could do that. But okay, and then Sam Beshevkin also had another question about removing the land area from your temperature measurements so that they were only representative of water temperatures.
Yes, we absolutely do that. That is a huge step in our pre-processing pipeline, is to apply a land mask before we look at water temperature trends. But you are highlighting a really important point, which is that especially in the narrow, maybe I can go back to one of them, especially in these narrow channels, I do believe it is a true signal of water surface temperature. But that said, these narrow channels do tend to get a lot more impact from land adjacency. So you're going to get a lot more heat being reflected off the land that does result in increased water temperatures as well. So that is a critical distinction to make, and one that we're definitely looking into.
Great. Another question was about satellite-based monitoring of turbidity, distinguishing suspended sediments from algal cells.
Yeah, and maybe I can go back to, so there are, that's definitely another important challenge. But we do know from looking at their spectral signatures that they are different from each other. But it speaks to the importance of getting a lot of ground-based data. And I will say that for this project, we have had some challenges in evaluating our satellite-based chlorophyll estimates. There are other projects where, and it's likely due to how they're doing the matchups between water samples, either with spectral measurements or with returning the samples to lab and doing more focused pigment analysis. in our project, the way that we had been sampling for chlorophyll is by dropping a probe and taking these vertical profiles. And in many cases, we see that algal blooms form at the surface. And so if you're not sampling that measurement right at the surface correctly, that will cause a difference to be seen between what we're seeing in satellite, which in that case, I was actually trusting the satellite imagery more than I was trusting the probe measurements. So there's some elements of how you do that comparison that are going to be critical to validating your satellite-based chlorophyll estimates, but that is definitely an issue, and that's why we need to have good ground-based measurements to validate the remote sensing-based estimates.
Great. Yeah, that's actually a nice segue to this additional question, or next question from Michael Dirks, who said, are there parallel questions between remote sensing work and in situ water quality monitor sensor work in water reservoirs and conveyance pipes? Are there researchers emerging in the applications of immersed water sensors and parallels to remote sensing efforts? And I'd maybe also add to maybe if you can speak to any like in situ, like hyperspectral sensors or field-based radiometry that could also like add to other traditional remote sensors like chlorophyll A or.
Yes, absolutely. So the immediate example that comes to mind is Dr. Hester's work, where she's developing optical proxies to estimate methyl mercury presence. And that is not a remote sensing project. That's completely field-based and looking into these optical proxies. So there is definitely a precedence to using optical data to assess these types of constituents. So you might imagine, a common piece of laboratory equipment might be a benchtop spectrophotometer. And even there are field portable ones where you can take something out into the field, insert a water sample, and try and get some spectrophotometric information. Yes, there's definitely ongoing efforts to look at this at more of a kind of field and laboratory scale. Which, I go back to turbidity being so amenable to this because it is, based on optics. It does lend itself well to remote sensing based methodologies. As far as imaging spectrometers and in situ radiometry, that's a core part of the in situ data sets that we use to, so you could basically take those same data in the field, apply many of these algorithms or develop new algorithms to relate those measurements to these constituents. Do the same thing with your remote sensing data sets. And it basically gives you a test to see if you've done a good job with your atmospheric correction. Because if there is a huge mismatch, then there's likely, it's often due to atmospheric correction because 90% of the signal that we see at sensor on the satellite platform is due to things going on in the atmosphere. And so if you remove that portion of the signal, by leveraging in situ radiometry, that could certainly help you understand what uncertainty is being caused by the atmosphere. Yes, and I also, before I forget, I also do have colleagues who have been developing, field-based spectrometers that can be instrumented on piers or docks. And so actually a colleague of mine just installed one on San Luis Reservoir on the basalt boat launch. I don't know if he's gotten any of the data back yet, but certainly we're very excited to take a look at those data sets and use that as a way of assessing our satellite based estimates.
Who is that?
Nick Tufilaro.
Oh, great. Okay.
He's a researcher at Oregon State University. And he also he's working on a startup as well. NASA also does have a bunch of buoys where we take these data, both a sensor pointed at the water as well as a sensor pointed up so that we can better characterize influences from the atmosphere. And that is to help, kind of validate future or current and future NASA satellite missions that are focused on studying oceans and coasts.
Oh, great. Okay, there was, oh, actually, you know what, we're approaching our time here. So maybe, Christine, if anybody didn't have a question answered yet, maybe Christine, if you're able to like stay on a minute or two and you could just address some of those. They're mainly in the chat, not the Q&A. We've attended to all those. But for those folks, hopefully saw we did post that survey. If you're able to fill that out, and then Devin also put the link to the website. So Christine, thank you so much for presenting. That was a really wonderful talk, and exciting to see all the products that are being developed. And her email is up there, so I encourage folks to follow up if you have additional questions, and sign up for our listserv. And we're doing these talks monthly, and we're trying to improve all of our understanding about how data can be used to manage water quality resources. So thank you, everybody. Oh yes, Christine.
Yes, if you're interested in working with any of these data sets, please feel free to email me. I'm always excited to hear about other application use cases. Or I can connect you with other colleagues who might be a better fit than one of us. But either way, I look forward to hearing from you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for that invitation. All right, have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.